What's going on, guys? Today we're going to be talking about the hip flexors, and for a little bit of context and background into this story. So I was having a conversation with one of my clients. I've been working with him now for 6 weeks, and he was talking about how his old trainer used to often reference that his hip flexors were weak. And now whenever he discusses his lower body training and his performance output with me, he talks about how his hip flexors are this big limiting factor and how we need to train them more. And that's where I think we need to do a better job as athletes, lifters, and coaches defining tight and weak, and not just arbitrarily throwing them around to define things, especially like muscles and their function. So I wanted to put this video together and discuss how to better conceptualize hip flexors that may be limiting your range of motion or your performance output, and why I don't like using the terms tight and weak to describe them. So 3 reasons why I don't like saying a muscle is tight or weak is because, number one, the moment you say that as a trainer to a lifter or athlete, they will start to subconsciously put themselves into a box of what they are. So if I said, hey, your hip flexors are tight, what are you gonna go do? You're likely gonna start doing a bunch of mobility work, but do you actually need that per your overall performance output and goals? As in the example earlier mentioned, my client literally has a fixation on his hip flexors being weak, but it's more or less me trying to help him navigate around that your hip flexors are not necessarily weak. We just need to focus a little bit better with some of our exercise selection and creating harmony with your programming to get better performance output. Plus, focusing on the skill component of movement patterns in general. Number 2 is that tight and weak are fairly arbitrary terms. As a trainer and coach, if you're telling somebody that a muscle is tight or weak, what are we actually relating that to? What task? How are we defining it? Because how a lifter and how yourself interpret tight and weak in your body are going to be individual and different. So when we say tight and weak, I think we can start to build that, once again, the subconscious thought pattern, and then put ourselves into this box over an arbitrary term that isn't really describing what's going on. Number 3 is that oftentimes when we feel like something is tight, it's actually our nervous system limiting us from a range of motion that it doesn't feel stable or strong in. That does not mean that a muscle is physically shortened. And when we say weak, we have to once again ask, what are we defining that with? How are we relating that to the task at hand? More than likely, your hip flexors are not outright weak. They may just need a little bit more direct attention for what you are trying to accomplish. So when we use terms like tight and weak, it's not necessarily that they're erroneous or instantly bad. I just think that they can be a little bit misleading, especially for lifters and athletes who are looking to people who have more credentials in their realm of work for answers. When you say somebody has something that's weak or tight, they're gonna then subconsciously bias what they're doing and then potentially waste time doing things that they might not necessarily need. But now let's talk about what the hip flexors are and what they physically do. So now when talking about the hip flexor muscles, our primary hip flexor is the iliopsoas. This is the combination of the iliacus and the psoas major roped into one thing, and that's why we call it the iliopsoas. We also have the rectus femoris, which plays a role in hip flexion when the knee is bent to 90 degrees. That is a biarticulate muscle that also works as a knee extensor. And then we have other synergist muscles that play a role in assisting with hip flexion, including the sartorius. So now what do these muscles do? Well, their main role is going to be hip flexion. Now, it is important to note that when your body is in different positions, these muscles will be firing at different rates. So for example, the rectus femoris is a great example here because it will play a higher role with the iliopsoas to assist with hip flexion when the knee is bent to 90 degrees. So when we're talking about hip flexion, it's important to remember that different muscles will be firing at different points, and that's why it is important that if you're going to include some direct hip flexion work, to create a little bit of variability there to train yourself through different ranges of motion when flexing the hip. In addition to hip flexion, these muscles will also balance the posterior pelvic muscles, so they can play a role in how the pelvis is orienting, and they will also play a role in pelvis and lumbar stabilization depending on the task at hand. Now, when we're talking about training these muscles and moving away from calling them tight and weak, what should we physically do? All right, so 3 tips for more effective hip flexor training include: number 1, if you are planning to include more direct hip flexor work into your training, do not change what you are currently doing. Find ways to implement accessories accordingly that don't add a ton of time to your workouts or derail your current progress. If we are able to add accessories in, that will create a positive carryover to our overall performance output while not changing what we're doing. That is going to be our best strategy for continuing our progress without focusing on arbitrary shit that we may not necessarily need, especially at a high volume. The second thing to think about is training the hip flexors through different ranges of motion. So train them through a lengthened position, train them through a shortened position, and include variety depending on your goals at hand. And then that leads us to number 3, which is choosing variations that actually align with your overall performance output goals. This means that if your goal is to improve your hip flexor strength for your just overall lifting, let's say it's in the squat, this means that you're not wasting hours on hours doing mobility work for the hip flexors, which may not even create that much carryover for what we're trying to accomplish. So being conscious of what your goals are and then relating in accessories that make sense for the carryover to these goals and not adding a ton of time, that is a sweet spot that I want you to take from this video. Now I'm going to show you 6 hip flexor exercises to consider, and this does not mean take all these exercises and just throw them into your program. It means consider where you may be lacking and where the hip flexors actually may be hindering your performance output a little bit, and then implementing in a few of these at a time to see what gives you the best outcomes. So track and then gauge what is working best for you in regard to the carryover to your goals, and then that will give you a better framework as to where your hip flexors may be lacking if they are creating any negative impact on your performance output. The first exercise is the supine cable hip flexion. So I love this exercise because we get to use the floor as a constraint as a means to then progress with this movement. Plus, with the floor, we can really focus on stabilizing the opposing leg, the pelvis, and torso to really isolate the hip flexors. So with this exercise, think about 2 things. Number 1, with the opposing leg, try to ground it and keep that knee at about 90 degrees. This is going to allow you to keep your pelvis in a more neutral and static position. And then with the torso, try to ground it and keep that lower back pressed into the ground. If you're creating hip flexion and also arching at the lower back, then you either need to scale the weight down on the cable or find a range of motion that works for you. This is a great movement to really focus on isolating the hip flexors, and it's a great movement to scale with the floor. The second exercise is the seated banded hip flexion. So I love this exercise because we're going to get to train the hip flexors in a shortened position, and you could pretty much perform this anywhere at any time of the day. So a couple things to think about here is with your seat, try to find a seat that's a little bit higher than would put your femur at parallel with the ground. So I'm a little bit higher than what I would be at 90 degrees if I was sitting with my femur parallel to the floor. And then what I want you to think about is that when you are doing your hip flexion part of this movement, think about bringing that leg in a more vertical path. Try not to flare out that knee and go into an external rotation of the hip as you do these. It's going to better isolate the hip flexors. And then with that opposing leg, if you want, focus on finding your big toe on that foot, and that'll help then keep you a bit more aligned and not shifting as you go into hip flexion on each of the legs. The third exercise is an L-sit with a leg lift. So this is once again going to be training the hip flexors in a shortened position, but we don't have a knee bend, so we're going to get to focus a little bit more on the iliopsoas, along with some passive rectus femoris work and some passive sartorius work. Now, with these, I want you to focus on adapting with your overall range of motion that you already possess and then improving as you go. So if you're not sitting perfectly vertical like I would prefer you to be, that is totally fine. As you can see, I have a little bit of lean to mine, and that's because my range of motion is a bit limited, but as you do these more, you're going to get better at them. Now, when you are going into hip flexion, think about pointing your toe, flexing your quad, and then keeping that other side of the hip grounded. So we want to have a pelvis that is in neutral static position, and that way we can fully isolate the hip flexors. And then as you flex and as you go through hip flexion, think about physically using the hip flexors. Yes, thinking about what we're doing will actually benefit us in this movement. The fourth exercise is the hanging bent knee raise. So I like this because we get to train hip flexion through a more vertical positioning with the body. Now, 2 things to think about with this movement is that when you're going through flexion of the hip and you're bringing those knees up, exhale. This is going to award us with a little bit more range of motion and allow us to fully contract the core musculature and the hip flexors. The second thing to think about is to limit your overall momentum. So obviously use a gripping strategy that works for you. I'm using a neutral grip here, and that's because 1, that's what my machine has that works best for me, but 2, that's where I also feel strongest and I could really limit momentum. If we can limit momentum, we can better focus on what the core musculature and the hip flexors are doing in order to create their contractions. The fifth exercise is the kettlebell march. So you can use a bilateral load or unilateral load like myself, scale it based on your needs and what equipment you have available. So 3 reasons why I like this movement is number 1, we're going to get some passive benefit for the core musculature as we work to balance and mitigate that load that we're holding. Two, it's a great tool for conditioning hip flexion, especially towards the end of a workout where you're also trying to get some passive core benefit. And then number three, we get to train hip flexion through a vertical positioning. So when doing this movement, a couple things to think about is number one, as you are bringing that knee up into hip flexion, exhale. This is going to allow us to better focus on the range of motion and the contraction that we're trying to create. And then number two, with that opposing leg, focus on what's happening at the glute, pelvis, and foot. This can be a fantastic tool for highlighting, hey, am I leaning too far into one hip? Hey, am I actually not grounding the foot when I'm going into hip flexion? Am I not actually contracting the opposing glute? So be mindful of what that opposing leg is doing when creating stability and moving through unilateral hip flexion. The final exercise is the banded dead bug. Now, if you do not have your normal dead bug, please start with that before progressing to this movement. The reason I love this for hip flexor work and just general core work is number one, we get to focus on a lot of what the hip flexors are doing with that additional band and resistance. And two, by having that arm moving in the upper portion of the body, we get to really focus on how the core at the upper level and lower level is engaging throughout active hip flexion. So as you move those arms and as you move those legs, focus on keeping that lower back grounded, and that will ensure that you're keeping enough tension in the core to make this both beneficial for the core musculature and the hip flexors. All right, guys, that wraps up this video about the hip flexor muscles. Hopefully this video makes sense and you're able to contextually apply it to your training and your goals and needs and not waste a bunch of time potentially on a bunch of things that you may not necessarily need. In addition to hopefully limiting putting ourselves into mental constraints like tight and weak, which can be very arbitrary. If you have any questions on this video, hit me in the comments below or reach out to me directly, whatever you're most comfortable with. And as always, guys, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.